So it isn't just schools, programmers and publishers that see new opportunities in online education. John Zornig and Andrew Dekker are here from the University of Queensland to discuss the university's involvement in the development and deployment of the Open edX online education platform.
Nice to be here. I'm John. This is Andrew, my senior developer. So UQX stands for UQ's involvement in the edX project. edX is a non-profit set up by MIT at the bottom and Harvard, two fairly large and prestigious universities in the US, who both entered independently the new world of MOOCs back in about 2011 and decided to get together, pool their resources and create this non-profit edX in 2012 to explore the MOOC phenomena and feed back into their universities. edX set about creating a consortium of global universities that wanted to engage, and UQ was one of the very first universities to sign up as a member of the edX consortium. We joined in 2013, about May, and the project got started. The project now is a bit over a dozen people. We have videographers, animators, learning designers, project managers, and technical developers. Originally I was the senior architect and the data czar. I've since moved to being the director. Andrew's recently been our senior developer, and most of the stuff we'll be talking about is things that Andrew's been mostly involved in coding, because I don't get much chance to code anymore. This is what a typical edX MOOC looks like. Once MOOC platforms, both in the university sphere and in professional education, business, all sorts of areas. There are national MOOC platforms in various countries that are running on this. Open edX is basically the open source MOOC platform for anyone that wants to create a platform for large-scale online learning. When UQ joined edX, on my first, the role I'd had at UQ prior to that point was as a learning tools developer, and one of the technologies we'd been using in our learning tools development was learning tools interoperability. This is an IMS global standard. And when we visited edX just after we'd joined, they found out that I was an LTI expert, and so the first engagement we had with the platform was to demonstrate to them how easily it was to get LTI integration into the edX platform. And that day at the edX offices just outside of MIT in Cambridge in the US was the first day I'd actually written a line of Python code because I'd done most of my work in PHP and other languages prior to that. But the edX platform is primarily a Python Django based set of applications. It does have some components in Ruby on Rails and various other bits and pieces because it's a very large piece of software. But our first integration was with the platform. The engagement with the platform was in developing LTI integration for it and contributing that because we had expertise in it. So how do we use edX? There are basically two worlds. Software as a service, which is edX.org. That's because we're a member, we use the edX hosted platform. We don't run edX software ourselves at UQ, other than Andrew runs it as his development platform. But we deploy everything to edX.org, which is effectively a cloud service for us. But all the other users of the edX platform use OpenEdX. They deploy their own, whether they run it in the cloud or host it themselves. and so forth. You can see some of the differences, but the base package is the same, yeah. So I will hand over to Andrew to talk more about the really technical stuff, because I've left that behind in a former life now. It's been a while since I've cut code myself. Thank you.
So basically with as John said, there's two worlds. So a lot of universities will actually just spin up their own instance of edX, style it, customize it. As far as the world's concerned, it's not edX, but behind the scenes it is. Whereas what we do is we work directly with edX, which has a heap of benefits, marketing, etc. We don't have to advertise. Anyone that goes to edX.org can find it, etc. But there's problems with that as well. So this is an example of the edX architecture. So it's built for scale. It runs primarily on AWS, and it uses pretty much every AWS service they have. So it's fairly intense. And as John said, and it's probably not obvious here, but most of the components are Django-based, and it uses SQL and Mongo primarily for the backend. So when working with edX, we primarily work with them directly contributing to the core through GitHub. They have a heap of repositories. The main one is the edX platform. And how many people here are developers, just out of curiosity? About 50-50? Okay, so this kind of repository is massive and continually changing, and for the developers in the room, you can see there's like 31,000 commits and 860 branches. So actually finding out what's going on is often difficult. But that being said, it's a very active code branch. So what we can do is we can develop a new learning tool feature, submit that to edX, work through them with the details, and as soon as that's done, that's now available on edX.org, not only for us, but for all the partner institutions. And any other institutions that are running OpenEdX, they can use that functionality as well. So it's a way that we can build software that not only works for us, but we can contribute it to the larger community. So that's already said. So just to give you a quick kind of insight into how UQ works with kind of edX, and at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is we're trying to build courses to teach people around the world about certain topics. And to do that, edX has some components built in, but often we have to generate our own tools, like our own simulations, our own animations, to really kind of get the concepts across. So we work with academics to find out what their learning objectives are. And then with edX, you have a heap of different options. So the quick and dirty version is essentially JavaScript enhancements, where similar to WordPress, you can put some code in, some JavaScript code, you can hack at it, you can style it, make it do what you want. Then, as John mentioned, we often use LTI, which if people haven't used it before and they're developers, essentially it's iframing an external site in, and there's a simple kind of OAuth-based API behind the scenes that's kind of communicating who the user is. The LTI tool can send back what grade they got for the tool, etc. And finally, XBlocks, which is the edX component architecture in Django. So it's built on top of Django, and it's a way that you can silo, build your little tool, and then it integrates with the rest of the platform. So when you're working with edX as a learning designer or as an academic, you basically get, I'm going to make a new page, and then I can place components on that page. And you get this little kind of drop down, so you can do problems, you can insert a video, insert some social functionality, or there's an advanced tool. So when you're going to advance, you're actually going to all these different XBlock components that are available in the system. So this is theoretically and kind of the best way to contribute to the to edX. However, You develop your XBlock. So edX actually has an XBlock testbed and an XBlock SDK repositories available on GitHub, so you can download that, build your own. Then you have to test your XBlock with the edX platform, and then you have to integrate your XBlock into the code base. Once all that's done, that's pretty much all the coding work done, but then you have to work through edX, which can actually be fairly time-consuming, because edX is a partnership across all the universities have their own ideas on how a certain learning objective or a tool should be developed and what it should give the user's experience. So that's a lot of back and forth code review. And then hopefully, once you've built your XBlock, you've got it deployed back into edX, they've accepted it, then one day it will show up as an available option in the edX platform. So, an alternative process. So Stanford isn't a edX partner as such. However, they do use OpenEdX to run a lot of their online courses. So alternatively, edX basically Stanford forks edX, does their own things, and then at some point in the future, they push back to edX and then work through the integration issues. So although Stanford, for example, isn't an edX partner, they're still contributing to the platform. So it's a diverse community. People are working with edX in different ways, but overall it's a platform that's kind of being built up by many different partners. So just a quick example of one of the things that we did recently was edX always had a tool called the Open Response, which would let students answer a question in a long form kind of essay style and then get it marked through peers. So we could ask, talk about Australia in the 1900s, a student would write a response, and then their response would get sent to 3 different peers. They would mark it, give comments, and come back, etc. So one of the things that we wanted through our academics was the development of a leaderboard. So rather than just having these open responses that really had no impact at the end, you kind of wrote it, submitted it, and you got some grades back at the end. You had no feeling of how you fitted within the rest of the cohort. So for this, because the open response was an XBlock, and of course open source, we could pull it down, we could modify it, we could go back through edX and deploy it. So that's just an example of how edX is a platform that you can actually work on, unlike things like Coursera or Udacity, where they're kind of locked off. And then one of the big functionalities that we're trying to get at the moment that we think will be incredibly useful for universities is being able to embed parts of an edX course back into standard LMSs such as Blackboard or Moodle. So rather than just edX being this all-consuming thing that takes content from other sources, we can actually take edX and plug it back into the university systems. So that's one of the things that we're working on at the moment. We're working on it in conjunction with Harvard and a few other places. But again, it's one of those things where every university has a different idea about what they want. Come on. So what does it all mean? Do you want to go through this? Or So one of the things when we started looking into this MOOC space is, what does it mean? In a classroom, you can actually gauge the intention of an audience. You can understand how your students are progressing through the content. But as soon as you take that online, you kind of lose that connection. Discussion forums kind of help, but it only really helps with the engaged students. So one of the things that we're working on fairly heavily is constructing a system for doing learning analytics on top of edX. So edX provides us with raw database dumps and clickstream logs, but that really doesn't mean too much. However, we've developed this platform, which again is open source, and the link's at the end, which allows us to break down the data that's in edX and actually start to pull out some useful analytics. So we've built a dashboard. The dashboard's not only for us, we're hoping that other edX partners and pretty much anyone that can find it useful can take it on, adapt it. It uses a fairly standard architecture, so it has a Python ingestion system, which then turns itself into a REST API, and then from that we have dashboard visualizations that can be plugged in. So we've designed this not only for our internal usage, but also a REST API so that academics, other researchers can take this data and actually understand what does it mean to be a student within a MOOC. How do you tell if a student is actually engaged in a MOOC, and why are they dropping out? And we don't know the answer yet. So that's me.
A few other little notes. MOOCs are pretty big. We've got a course on English grammar and style that started on Sunday. It had 66,000 enrollees on Sunday. Today it should later this afternoon pass 75,000. We're getting roughly 2,000, 2,500 enrolments a day at the moment, and it's not been our most popular course. Our most popular course to date's had 128,000 enrolments. We've got a course coming out in November that we hope will maybe be in the multiple 100,000. So it's a course for students learning English as a second language. So global appeal. edX already have over 4 million enrolled users. So I'm looking forward to the first MOOC that has more than 1 million students in one course. So that's pretty scalable when you consider at UQ the biggest course would be 1,200 students. Is Python, we use Python day in, day out. We also do a fair bit of stuff in the front end in JavaScript. I think this platform's a very significant platform in the world of software, because it's kind of a scalable internet business that all the software is available for anyone to use and apply to an education sub-niche that might support a new business or a new non-profit. There are a lot of non-profits members of edX, people like the International Monetary Fund, Linux Foundation is a member. The platform's getting a lot of adoption. So any questions?
I'm going to have to steal that mic.
So any questions?
Who's done a MOOC? Probably Python one. No?
Linux one.
A Linux one?
Yes, dude.
Just out of interest, because you were talking about XBlocks and component architecture, 2 questions. How do you configure and register additional components, and when the component architecture was built, have you guys looked into other component architectures in the Python world?
Yeah, so in terms of the XBlock architecture, edX kind of mandates that for the most part. So when we go to build a feature, so let me find it. Often we have multiple types of architectures that we can use in terms of developing our tools. Often because of the pragmatic implications of going through code review and academics asking us to do stuff at the last minute, they're kind of incompatible. The XBlock architecture, it's a standard that edX has developed. It's not directly tied to edX, and they make the SDK and the kind of protocols open source. So there's 4 or 5 GitHub repos that are all about XBlocks. So they are trying to push it out to the other MOOCs and other kind of the other learning tool providers. Kind of this sub-industry of strange protocols that learning
Part
systems
of the
use.
reason for the XBlock architecture is that an XBlock is kind of given a section of the page to render, and the architecture basically sandboxes any JavaScript with that the XBlock generates from the rest of the page, so that you can run a platform with XBlocks contributed by other people and still have a certain level of security about things behaving properly and not interfering with each other.
Yeah, I mean the XBlock architecture, because I do a bit of other Django stuff as well, it doesn't fit entirely into Django's kind of best practices, but it seems in the context of edX it actually works fairly well in sandboxing that kind of tool from the rest of the platform. So you're not dealing with the platform's strangeness on top of.
Provides a conceptualized data model for the student and the course and the cohort and so forth, so you don't actually have to deal with the underlying databases.
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, one thing I would say, and this is from me kind of coming from not really interacting that much with open source projects, is that edX, because it's so visible on the net, especially in these learning environments, it's actually a really good way to kind of get yourself into working on an open source project, because there's a really active community and very visible, and there's a lot of very simple functionality that just isn't there yet. So low-hanging fruit for anyone that's interested.
I had a question about your dashboard. The most interesting thing, I think, from my perspective about the effect on UQ is what's the effect of these courses on UQ, or what does UQ look like in 10 years' time? It's sort of more a MOOC question than a edX question.
Yeah, that's one of. Sorry. That's one of the big questions as director of the unit that we have to struggle with is justifying the expense of developing these courses, but working out what the business model is and what the contribution to the university is. So as a purely marketing exercise, they're actually not all that expensive, considering the number of people we reach. And the things we've been finding out about the demographics of the people we're reaching with the individual courses means that we can actually tailor courses to reach specific demographics around the globe. We tell people that we engineer our courses rather than just bang a bunch of content in there, and we go through a big process of defining who we think are the target markets and things like this before we even get down to what are the learning goals for the course and into those sorts of areas of design. So there's huge potential in the future, and online learning is growing massively, especially in the developed world, where the middle class is generating demand for higher education faster than universities can be physically built. So in China, India, Africa, online learning will be a major component of higher education because they will have no other option. So for a large part of the globe, students in the future will be prepped to expect higher education via online. And if we can provide it from Australia, rather than providing education as an export by getting students to come here with their money, they can stay there and just buy courses through PayPal or whatever. So.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank